asistir nada más al lugar con una cédula y tratar de evitar las cámaras. Número 2, bueno, en caso de emergencia, saldríamos por esta puerta y luego pueden elegir alguna de las puertas que dan hacia el exterior de la manera más ordenada posible. Sin más, damos inicio a la conferencia que se titula Populismo, consecuencias para la democracia, organizada en el marco de las actividades académicas de la Universidad de Costa Rica, particularmente del Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales, en coordinación con UCR Electoral. Queremos iniciar expresando un profundo agradecimiento a la Rectoría de la Universidad de Costa Rica y a la Oficina de Asuntos Internacionales y Cooperación Externa, cuyo apoyo ha sido fundamental para hacer posible esta actividad. También le agradecemos a la Escuela de Ciencias Políticas y al Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Políticos, quienes nos colaboraron con la traducción simultánea. Por otra parte, extendemos nuestro reconocimiento al Centro de Investigaciones en Comunicación y de manera muy especial a Sofía Bensofia Gurgi, traductora de esta conferencia, por su apoyo invaluable. Finalmente, gracias a todas y a todos ustedes por acompañarnos esta tarde. ¿Quién es Cas Mudde? No requiere una presentación, pero es un honor presentar a este profesor distinguido de la Universidad de Georgia, ampliamente reconocido como una de las principales voces a nivel internacional en el estudio del populismo, la extrema derecha y los retos contemporáneos para la democracia. Sus investigaciones han sido publicadas en 27 idiomas y han marcado un antes y un después en la comprensión del populismo, no solo en Europa, sino también en contextos globales y latinoamericanos. Sus libros como Populismo, A Very Short Introduction, and The Far and Right Today son referencias obligadas en la ciencia política contemporánea. A continuación, dejo con ustedes al doctor Cas Mudde con la conferencia Populismo, consecuencias para la democracia. Estaremos repartiendo unos papelitos para que al finalizar la conferencia ustedes puedan expresarnos sus preguntas y tener un diálogo más acotado con el colega. Muchísimas gracias. Sin más, recibamos con un fuerte aplauso al doctor Cas Mudde.
Okay, let's try that. Thank you to everyone who made this trip possible. Also, thank you very much to Francisco Robles, who has been my host and who has enabled me to see 6 soccer games in about 5 days, which is, even for me, a new record, and that has made this trip all totally worth it, and so I'm happy to do my labor now. The title was suggested, and it is, what I'm going to do is a pretty broad, more theoretical talk about populism and its relationship to democracy. I'm very happy to also talk about the far right, and I'm also very happy, well, not maybe very happy, but I'm willing to talk about US politics and Trump. You can ask me questions about this depressing situation after this talk. So what am I going to argue? My clicker. My clicker doesn't work. I'll just walk around. Then I have to sit because I have to click all the time. Okay, so my main arguments are going to be that populism has a complex relationship with particularly liberal democracy. Second, in most cases today, populism is an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. I will explain that. And third, I do believe that populism can be overcome, but not by a simple return to the past. And as so often, whenever people suggest a return to the past, it's not really the real past, it is an imagined past. Okay, so what do I think populism is? And I want to make it clear. Oh, screen disappeared. I will read it. So, I've defined populism as a fin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated, there it's up, into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be the expression of the general will of the people. So I want to make it clear that this is my understanding of populism. There are many other understandings of populism. There is a core that pretty much every definition of populism has, and that is the opposition between the people and the elite. My definition is different from various others in the sense that I believe that it is an ideology. It's a worldview. It's not pure strategy. Does that mean that every populist truly believes what he says? Because they're mostly he? Probably not. But a lot of politicians say things that they don't mean or believe in, but that still makes them relevant for understanding politics. Okay, so what is the theory of the relationship between populism and democracy? If you define democracy in a minimal sense as popular sovereignty and majority rule, so the idea that people should elect their own leaders, then populism is pro-democratic. But we usually use the term democracy for a system that is much more than that, which a better term is liberal democracy. And very simply stated, liberal democracy combines majority rule with minority rights. And populism is anti-liberal democracy. And this relationship is inherent in the concept of populism as defined before. So populism is a monist view, which means that it sees categories as homogeneous. The people are one. They all have the same interest and the same values. Liberal democracy is based on pluralism. The idea that society is constituted from different groups that have different interests and values, which are all legitimate. In that pluralist view, compromise is essential to liberal democracy. You have to work together with other people. But the essence of the distinction in populism is moral. It is between the pure of heart and the corrupt. And so populists are against compromise because they believe that compromise corrupts the pure people. So in the essence of populism is a rejection of the essence of liberal democracy. That's not a choice. So how do populism and democracy play out in practice? For a long time, we didn't know too much, because despite the fact that we talk a lot about populism, there weren't so many populist regimes. Exception, of course, in the tradition of South America, broader perhaps Latin America. But over the last 2-3 decades, we have had quite a lot of populist governments. So what do we see? We see that populists in power attack liberal values and liberal institutions. For example, they attack the independence of the media, they attack the independence of the judiciary, they attack the concept of minority rights. We also see that populists, whatever the political system, will centralize power in the executive. Best example, of course, at the moment, the US, where pretty much we have rule by executive order. All the power at the moment rests with the president. Congress has kind of just stopped doing its own work. But if you look at a parliamentary system like Italy, you see that Meloni, the prime minister, is trying to get more power from the legislature to the executive power. And the idea is very simple. The people are homogeneous. They all have the same interests and values, which means that they can be expressed by anyone who is part of the people. So Meloni, as the voice of the people, knows exactly what the people want. We don't need more people for that. So it's not about the traditional Führership of the Nazis, where you had this idea that the leader was the superior being. The leader knew better than everyone else. That's not the argument that populists make. Populists argue, I know what you want and what you feel because I am one of you. I'm not better, I'm the same. And so in Trump's brilliant American Carnage speech, which was his inauguration speech of 2017, which I make all my students read, and I can also suggest that you should read it. By and large, what he said was, you are now in the White House because I am in the White House. And so when the president is you, you don't need a Congress. You don't need courts. So what does this lead to? Traditionally, the idea was that populism leads to illiberal democracy. It means that elections are still being held, people still elect their leaders by majority, but minority rights, checks and balances, independence of judiciary, media are being eroded. But it's the question whether that truly is the case. Because if you look at a case like Venezuela, that is far beyond an illiberal democracy. That is a competitive authoritarian regime. There is a debate that the same holds for Hungary and even now for the United States. The problem with the idea of a competitive authoritarian regime is the idea is that the regime has an electoral advantage, but could potentially lose, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult to test, because how do we know that Orban can lose an election? How do we know that Trump can lose an election until he does? But if he wins, well, Trump might run again, but if Orban wins again, he might also simply be the most popular person. Doesn't necessarily mean election fraud. The idea of competitive authoritarianism is first and foremost, elections are free but unfair. And so in a competitive authoritarian regime, there are different parties. They can compete, but not on a level playing field. As said, in theory, populism should lead to an illiberal democracy, because they pretend that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. In practice, what we see is that populists do not only attack the liberal aspect, but also the democratic aspect. For example, in the US, by voter suppression, voter intimidation, or simply by celebrating authoritarian rule, as Trump does or Bolsonaro did, things like that. Now, when you look at populism from the perspective of politics, populism is both anti-political and uber-political. It is anti-political because it denies the existence of legitimate opposition. And politics is, in the most simple essence, like struggle over power between legitimate opponents. And so because in populism all the people are one and the same, and there's only one other group, which is the elite, but the elite is corrupt and therefore illegitimate. But at the same time, populism is also uber-political in the sense that they argue that everything should be subject to the will of the people. So a Supreme Court should not be above what the majority wants. The World Bank should not be above what the people want. The European Union should not be above what the people want. And that is a very important element of the populist argument, because it's very empowering. And I will elaborate on that later. So my argument is that the recent rise of populism has to do primarily with structural transformations, rather than with this idea that there are crises. Even if there wouldn't be crises, like the Great Recession, we would still have more populism than before. They're free, the rise of undemocratic liberalism, we'll speak about that, all of three more. A change in the relation between the rulers and the ruled. I think that's the most underdeveloped one. And then the democratization of the media. First point, the rise of undemocratic liberalism. This is debated under different terms, often things like neoliberal globalization or technocracy. But it extends beyond the economic. Over the last decades, in many countries, and particularly within the democratic sphere, politics have been taken in a formal sense democratically, but in spirit undemocratically. And what I mean by that is that politicians have, through parliament, by majority, taken decisions which either were never discussed with the people or went against the will of the majority of the people. And this includes issues like immigration in many cases, but in the European context, for example, the movement of power to the European level, but also a lot of privatizations. In many cases, these decisions were taken without them ever being discussed in the context of elections. So people never had the opportunity to vote on them. Again, in the narrow democratic perception, the politicians are elected to represent us, and they have a freedom to do that. But we kind of assume that we know what we're getting. Right? It's the idea that I'm not going to micromanage my politician, but the politician roughly stands for this, and that's what I will get. A lot of the key decisions on immigration, globalization, neoliberalism were never explicitly discussed. And so that create backlash, right? You get things that you were not asked, that you don't understand, or that you don't like. But they were also then often defended by so-called TINA politics. And TINA politics stands for there is no alternative. Or a reference to responsible politics. The argument is, well, we have to do this because of the markets. We have to do this because of the World Bank, the IMF, the United States, the European Union. Right? Now, that whole argument takes away power. Right? If you say there is no alternative, it means that you as a voter are powerless. Now remember that I said populists are uber political. They think everything is up to the will of the people. That is very empowering. When mainstream politicians say there is no alternative because the markets will not accept this, and a populist says, if we want to do this, we should. Then you have one where you're like, okay, so I'm meaningless, and the other one that says, you matter. The point is that TINA politics is a myth. There is always an alternative. The argument behind TINA politics is there is an alternative, but it's so costly or stupid that we shouldn't do it. Right? Now think about Brexit for a moment. Right? So Brexit was when the United Kingdom went out of the European Union. This was considered to be irresponsible. Being in the European Union was seen as there's no alternative. For decades, the idea was that you couldn't even get out of the EU. In fact, there was no procedure to get out of the EU. So anyone who said that we want to get out of the EU, people say you're crazy. That's impossible. Turns out it's not. Now, leaving aside the value of whether Brexit was right or wrong, what it shows is that there is an alternative, right? And that the populists present it. And I think that's underestimated, how important that is, that sense of empowerment. As said, I also think what's important is there's a democratization of representation. What do I mean by that? For much of the 20th century, I would say around the world, politics, including democratic politics, was elitist and paternalistic. Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, obviously conservatives, even communists, believed that the leaders knew better than the people. They knew what was best for them. And most people also believed that. Right? They would listen to their religious leaders, or they would listen to their trade union leaders about what to do. In the second half of the 20th century, and of course this depends a bit on which country and region, we saw two conflicting processes. We saw the rise of a political class. The vast majority of politicians in most democratic systems are professional politicians. Their lives have never done anything else. Increasingly, they are children of politicians. We see almost no working class anymore in many parliaments. We see fewer and fewer farmers. It is a closed-off class, whatever that party is of. Right? But at the same time, we see also a cognitive mobilization of the masses. What does that mean? The people are far more educated than before. The percentage of people that have at least a high school, but even college education, has exploded in many countries. But the education has also become much more horizontal. While in many countries, what the professor says is still true. I come from the Netherlands, let me assure you that's not the case in the Netherlands. But even in a country like Germany, which in my Dutch perception is very hierarchical, people today are educated much more horizontal. You discuss what is like, you no longer have a professor who tells you this is how the world looks. Right? At best you have a professor who tells you this is what the theory says, and then you have a discussion about that. That has massive consequences for how you see society. If you're educated with the idea that your voice matters, that you have competency politically, you're going to hold your leaders accountable. Neoliberalism strengthened this. In neoliberalism, like in the market, the client, the customer is king. Right? So at least in name, the people are the ones that say what the market should produce. Neoliberal language about politics is all about that. It's about catering to the customer, not the citizen, but the customer. So it's no longer even horizontal. It has a bit of a vertical element to it, in which the ruled are above the rulers. The idea is no longer that politicians lead the people. No, the idea is that politicians follow the people. Populism has added a moral distinction to that by saying that not only are the people more important than the leaders, but the people are pure and the elite are corrupt. The consequence for democratic politics is big, because democratic politics is based on the idea that people are represented by others and that there is a positive relationship between the two. Today we have by and large a negative relationship, where many people feel that they're not represented, and even worse, that the people who are elected are corrupt, are morally wrong. But the weird thing is that while the masses have democratized and now feel competent to judge the politicians, many of the elites, particularly the economic, but also the political ones, have become more elitist, arguing that life has become so complex that we have to listen to the experts to do. And of course, in a neoliberal context, experts are neoliberal economists, right? And they have very difficult models that we simple souls don't understand. Now I have to talk about the media, and yes, I will talk about social media, because otherwise all your questions will be about social media. I'm a media skeptic. Let me rephrase, I'm a social media skeptic. I know this is like cursing in the church, but I do not believe that social media has transformed political world. I think actually what has been far more important has been the privatization, or perhaps better, neoliberalization of the traditional media. Up until the late 20th century, in most countries, the traditional media, be they newspapers, radio, or TV, were largely public, particularly TV and radio, controlled by the state, therefore by the most important parties, or by the social structures that were related to those parties. Think about newspapers that were often linked to churches or to trade unions or organizations like that. As a consequence, the political mainstream had a very strong grip on the media in two ways. On the one hand, every medium would kind of whitewash its own group, right? So if you read a social democratic newspaper, you wouldn't read anything about the corruption in the Social Democratic Party. You would read a lot about corruption in the Christian Democratic Party, which you wouldn't read in the Christian Democratic newspaper. Now remember, well, you don't remember because you're young, but now you get access to all media. But when I grew up, you read one newspaper, and there was no internet. You didn't have access to the other newspapers. So your world was shaped by your structure in which you live, be that Catholic, social democratic, liberal. This changed. The other part was it helped with gatekeeping. You could keep others out, mostly racists, nationalists, anti-Europeans, whatever the thing was you didn't like, you could just starve for air. This changed first, not with social media, but actually with the neoliberal media logic of the privatized media. And it's important that even public media in many countries have a neoliberal logic. In the Netherlands, for example, we still have a public media, but they're all the time being evaluated on the basis of how competitive they are compared to private media. Not on the basis of do they give the right information, no, how big is your market? And so what sells? Scandals. Scandals sell. Who provides scandals? Populists. And so populists are too good to ignore for the neoliberal media. And I want to make it clear, while there's a lot to critique of the media and the media establishment, despite what we think and what many journalists think, the media are not the watchdog of democracy. The media are an economic business. If we don't read these articles, they don't publish them. This idea that the New York Times writes all of incredibly annoying anti-woke op-ed pieces because they believe in it, sure they believe in it, but if no one reads them, or we don't have all the liberal outrage on social media about it, they won't place it. Fox News is also about money. Fox News was against Trump, but its viewership was pro-Trump. And so after trying to ignore Trump and criticize Trump for several months, they changed, because otherwise there's no business, right? So it's the logic that helps and that weakens the gatekeeper role, because it's no longer about what is a responsible position, it's about what sells. Now, social media has further eroded this agenda setting and gatekeeping function of the traditional media. Because if something is big on social media, then it is potentially big in the regular media too. On top of that, journalists are among the most online people in the world. Even today, it is stunning how many journalists are spending their whole day on Twitter, X. Even though everyone knows what a far-right hellhole it has become and how biased it is. But if you talk to journalists, they will often think that, yes, this is extreme, but roughly this is the world, this is society. And so I don't think that social media has transformed. I don't see social media as a cause of the rise of populism. I see it as a catalyst. It has given a push to a development that had already started with the privatization of traditional media. And again, let me use Trump, because he's a very good example. When you say Trump, you say Twitter. First of all, Trump was made by the traditional media. Like, his show, The Apprentice, was on NBC, one of the traditional networks. Trump has been in the traditional media as long as he lives. When he started the 2016 campaign, if I remember correctly, he had 2 million followers on what was then still Twitter. 2 million is nothing in a country of 330. Everything he said and did was live on CNN. During the 2016 campaign, it didn't matter where I was, CNN had Trump on. There was a calculation that the traditional media gave Trump an equivalent of $6 billion in free advertisement. Like, if he would have to pay for that media coverage, it would have cost $6 billion. That will do way more than whatever you tweet. So social media is important if it can be translated through traditional media, because most people still get their information from that. Young people less, but young people also vote less. Summary, I have argued populism is pro-democracy but anti-liberal democracy in theory. In practice, we see that they also undermine democracy. I've argued that populism is an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. I've argued that it feeds off inherent tensions within democracy between majority rule and minority rights, and that while economic crises can help populism, the rise has structural causes. And the reason that I emphasize structural causes, it means that it cannot easily and quickly be changed. And then finally, I've argued that paradoxically populism is on the rise at a time that people are more liberal democratic than ever before. Solutions. Can you stop? Hey, can you stop being on the phone? Hello? Thank you. That's why I don't let my students use phones in my class. Can we defeat populism? Not easily. It has taken decades for populism to rise. It will take decades for populism to go down significantly. But more importantly, populism is a symptom rather than the cause of the crisis of democracy. Consequently, our question should be, how can we strengthen liberal democracy? If there's more support for liberal democracy, then logically there will be less support for populism. If there's less support for populism, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's more support for liberal democracy. What can mean is that more people no longer participate in democratic politics, which is also not the solution. Anti-populism and technocracy make things worse rather than better. In light of particularly Brexit, but also Trump, Bolsonaro, there has been an anti-populist reflex, where the argument is that the people are corrupt, they're stupid, they can't really decide, they just follow whoever sells them the easiest product, right? And what we need is a morally pure elite again, who don't listen to the people, but who know what is right. And what we need is government by technocrats. As if technocrats don't have ideologies. As if economists don't have a neoliberal ideology under it, right? The point is that, as I argued, populism is in many ways a product of this technocracy. And so if we go back to it, people will not be happy. Final point, how do we get out of this? I think we should repoliticize and re-ideologize politics. What do I mean by this? Let's go back to Tina. There is no alternative. That argument should never be used. What you should do is when you defend, for example, staying in the European Union, is not saying, well, if we go out of it, we have World War III. Or if we go out of it, the country will implode. That's simply not true, and people know it. What you should argue is that if we go out of the EU, the costs are this high. The benefits are only this big. That makes no sense. Therefore, we choose, which is power, to stay in. You don't argue against the death penalty by saying, we are a member of the Council of Europe, and therefore we cannot abolish it. You can, because you can get out of the Council of Europe. Hopefully you would argue we are against the death penalty because it's inhumane and we have structural racism, which creates horrible decisions. But if you don't want to go there, you can say, we don't want to abolish the death penalty because it would bring only these benefits, and the cost we have to pay is being kicked out of Council of Europe and the European Union, which has all of these benefits. Right? So everything is political. You always make a choice, and you have to explain why you make those choices. But choices should not purely be pragmatic. One of the big problems of contemporary politics is that ideology has been taken out, or at least has been made invisible. And politicians from Tony Blair to Mark Rutte in the Netherlands to most mainstream politicians pretend to be pragmatic, which means that you come up with a problem and they will solve it. What they forget is that one of the essences of politics is defining what the problem is. Immigration is now a problem. 100 years ago, it just was. 70 years ago in the Netherlands, it was an opportunity. If you take on board the issue of immigration as a problem, which is defined by the far right, and you say, well, immigration is a problem because it threatens national security and identity. You can only solve it by applying far-right policies. What we need is to tell people what our worldview is. Sadly, we don't have one. It's not only a social democratic problem. The center-right also doesn't have its own ideology anymore. As far as people still define conservatism, when conservatives do that these days, it is pretty much what the far right is. So we need a social democracy for the 21st century. We need a Christian democracy for the 21st century, a liberalism, a conservatism. Why do we need it? Because we live in a period of crises. Right? Depending where you live, we've gone through many. 9/11, the Great Recession, the so-called immigration crisis, Russia, COVID, whatever it is. It's not going to decrease. My slightly demagogic example is if I give you $100, you will ask me why I give it to you. If I tell you because I want to, you will take it. You don't need more. Now, if I ask you for $100, you will also ask me, why do you want it? If I say, because I want to, you will want more. Right? And that is where we are today. We are in a world where we have to give up things, where things are under pressure, right? Because of climate change, because of just ends of growth, whatever it is. We can't get what we had hoped that we would get. And we want to know why that is the case. And the argument can only be because we want to get to this type of world. And so ideology has to be the base in which you ground your policies. And it's only in that ideology that you also empower people. Because in that way you say, okay, you are part of creating that world. You are part of it. We make these decisions together. And that takes the strongest part out of populism, which is its sense of empowerment. However fake it is, it has it, whereas mainstream politics doesn't have it at this time. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias al doctor Cas Mudde por esta excelente presentación, de verdad muy claro, y yo creo que lo que hace es más que nada abrir el debate. En ese sentido hemos decidido sustituir los papelitos por la palabra para realmente poder conversar y debatir. Así que vamos a abrir un espacio de preguntas. Solo les pedimos por favor que sean breves y despacio porque estamos haciendo la traducción ahora sí simultánea. Ya les subí el volumen. Entonces, vamos a dar inicio a esta fase de este encuentro.
El poder más potente del mundo, él es autoritario y no se deja, es muy grosero porque él no deja que lo jodan. Hay un concepto que creo que la Escuela de Ciencias Políticas nos debería aclarar sobre ese populismo que es libresco. Allá en Europa yo no conozco al señor de Hungría, ni mucho menos. Parece que son malos, Trump es apestoso, pero el malo, el populista autoritario es Maduro. Eso es una guerra asimétrica. Claro que al profesor no le dicen todas las barbaridades que yo dije, solo le traducen lo que sea políticamente correcto. Muchas gracias, señor.
¿Alguien más? Francisco, podemos cambiar.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Yo soy Dani, soy estudiante de cuarto año de la carrera de Ciencias Políticas. Bueno, pido una disculpa por el incidente con el celular, entonces le pido una enorme disculpa. Muy interesante estuvo la charla y mi pregunta va en función a cómo todos estos presidentes o gobernantes que casi siempre se posicionan hacia un lado como a la derecha del espectro político, ¿por qué estos gobernantes tienden a tomar estas conductas o estas formas de gobernar que lo que hacen es llevar a su gobierno a el populismo? Por ejemplo, vemos el caso de Javier Milei en Argentina, el caso de Bukele en El Salvador y pues para no ir muy largo el caso de Rodrigo Chávez acá en Costa Rica y obviamente el caso notorio de Donald Trump. ¿Hasta qué punto todas estas conductas o esta forma en la que ellos llevan sus gobiernos se podrían explicar en función de todo lo que usted nos ha expuesto? Entonces, para enfocarlo tal vez en el caso latinoamericano. Muchas gracias.
Should we take more? Okay. ¿Alguien tiene un lapicero? Gracias. Una más.
Muchas gracias. Tal vez así, espero, voy. Sí. Sí, sí. Listo. No, muy brevemente, o sea, me parece sumamente interesante esta idea de repolitizar y volver a incluir, digamos, como la ideología, el pensamiento de alguna manera sobre cuáles son los objetivos que queremos como sociedad o como un grupo dentro de la sociedad. Y, no sé, me recuerda un poco también como, pensé un poco como en el libro este de Mark Fisher, como Capitalism, is there no alternative? ¿No? Que es como la pregunta, ¿no?, de esta misma idea de Tina, y la idea es como que quiero saber si ha visto como algún intento, digamos, si considera que había algún intento de alguna forma, de alguna agrupación política en tratar de crear otra vez como esa idea de crear como entrenamiento de cuadros, ¿no? O sea, antes había escuelas ideológicas en los partidos políticos, antes había congresos que hacían esto y creo que se ha ido perdiendo mucho, justo por lo que él dice, y me interesa mucho como ver un poco sobre lo que piensa de eso.
Thank you. I will ignore the first one. That was a statement. The second one, almost all politics is going to the right. It's not specific to populism. At the turn of the century, right, we had the pink wave here, and populism was on the left, with Chavez, with Correa, with Morales. Populism can be combined with almost anything. There is left populism, it's just not so popular at the moment, and the whole left is not popular at the moment. So there are some similarities between particularly nationalism and populism, in the sense that both are monisms, both look at the main group as homogeneous. And so when you see the people as homogeneous and pure, it's not too difficult to combine that with nationalism, which sees the people as homogeneous in an ethnic sense, right? But as said, Chavez was as populist as Trump. Podemos in Greece is as populist as, or was as populist as Le Pen in France. So I don't think that there's something specifically with populism. I think we're just at the moment in a very right-wing turn. Well, I wouldn't like to say globally, but certainly in the Americas and in Europe. And I think it's in part a backlash against a partly real and a partly perceived success of progressivism. going from the welfare state to, for example, here in the Latin American context, more south and central, but still gender equality, LGBTQI rights, which of course are not actually achieved. We don't have gender equality, not even in Norway. But progress has been made, and demands are being made, which are much more radical and far-reaching than they were decades ago. And people feel threatened. Like, men feel threatened, straight people feel threatened, ethnic majorities feel threatened. And so this is the theory of status loss. It's not actually that you lose anything in a material sense, but you lose your privilege. You lose your supremacy. Like, by giving LGBTQI people also rights, human rights after all, I, as a straight white male, don't have fewer rights, but I have fewer privileges. The problem is, until recently, we didn't acknowledge these as privileges. So many people feel that what they always had was what liberal democracy was. We've also, including the left, for decades claimed that gender equality had been achieved, that gay rights had been achieved. And now they want even more, right? And so now you get the narrative, which is very strong in the culture war narrative, of they want to have special privileges, because women already have gender equality, and they already control the debate through political correctness, right? And so now they want to be more than us. And so I think the status loss element is something that feeds the right, because the right is mostly about culture and identity. Even here in Latin America, while nativism isn't central, authoritarianism is. And authoritarianism is about order. And order is about status. And so while here the enemy is not the ethnic other, here the enemy is maybe the secular, or the woman, or feminist, or the sexually deviant. They threaten the traditional order. Are there examples of inspiring people? Yeah. So it depends a little bit, right? I mean, I'm a lefty. I'm an old school social democrat, which by today's standards would be radical left. When I grew up, it was just almost the center in the Netherlands. I'm inspired by AOC in the US. I think AOC is a once-in-a-lifetime political talent. She is capable of merging the socio-economic and the socio-cultural in a way that Bernie Sanders often can't. At the same time, she is not a utopian. She understands that you have to compromise, that you can't get 100%, but that 80% is also progress. She takes a lot of critique from the social media left for that. At the same time, while certain things that she and I would say the left in the US say is more progressive than anywhere else, including in Europe, for example, on multiculturalism and particularly on transgender rights, the left wing of the Democratic Party is far and ahead away from the left wing in Europe. On many other issues, they fight struggles that were decided 70 years ago in the Netherlands. And so I think if you look particularly at socioeconomic issues, for me personally, again, I'm a social democrat, how to transform the welfare state so that it is sustainable financially, environmentally, and in other ways within the 21st century, without patriarchy, without heteronormativity, without white supremacy, is the ultimate question. I'm not sure whether we can learn, at least in Northern Western Europe, too much from the American debate, because the standard is so much lower, right? Outside of that, it really is that there are some true libertarians, like libertarian is a euphemism for the far right these days, but there are some real libertarians who just want the minimal state. I don't agree with it, but it is an ideological position, right? I think what I really miss is Christian Democrats with a vision for today, for which I think there's a large market, if you want to use that term, right? And you don't see that debate. Right?
Tal vez podemos tomar dos más. Sí. Ah, sí, perdón, voy acá y acá. Ahí.
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes, profesor. I've always had the question of how Donald Trump is able to say or tell his voters and his followers that he does not belong to an elite, if for many years we've seen him being part of an elite, an economic elite, real estate in New York, etc., and have this question. So populism in its highest moment is able to reconfigure that elite of which he believes.
Well, Mr. Mudde, thank you very much for such a brilliant dissertation. You spoke about when populism conditions the institutional framework, for example, media, but the judiciary, for example. But what happens when the institutional framework conditions the populism and gives freedom to the populist leader to act effectively against the institution itself? Because, for example, you spoke about Meloni in Italy, and she's trying to centralize the power in the executive, but I bet she hasn't progressed as much as Donald Trump in the US, for example, because the Italian institutional framework doesn't give her the same freedom to act as the American framework gives to Donald Trump. So what happens when the institutional framework gives this freedom to the populist? Aren't the institutions today being one of the most responsible to the rise of the populism in the world?
Thank you. I will work my way back. Yeah, I really like that question about institutions, because I think it's important and it's misunderstood. There's a lot of debate at the moment in virtually every country of changing the electoral system. Almost every country that has a strong populist, which today is almost always a far-right politician, they want to change the electoral system. In the UK, they want to make it more proportional. In the Netherlands, they want to make it more majoritarian. That already tells you something. Perhaps it's not the electoral system that is the problem, right? Political institutions create the environment in which politicians act. They set boundaries, right, but they also create opportunities. You can pretty much achieve the same thing in any system, just with different ways. For a very long time, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, the idea was that majoritarian electoral systems were the best protection against the far right. Because in proportional systems, you can easily get represented, right? But you get a little bit. In a majoritarian system, it's very hard to win, but if you win it all, right? I think that what we see very clearly in the US today is that institutions don't matter much. Because institutions are nothing but the people in the institutions. A constitution doesn't do anything. A constitution has to be enforced. It is not being enforced at the moment by the Supreme Court. Congress can overrule every single executive order of Trump. It chooses, the people in Congress choose not to do it, right? And so it's not the institutional system of the US. In fact, the institutional system of the US is probably the best to counter individual leaders. It is an incredibly complex system which was truly designed not to function, to make the state kind of not function. But now you have, and this goes against everything we think about politicians, right? We always think politicians are power hungry and self-serving. And you have Congress, which just abdicates power. It just has decided, we're just going to let this dude do whatever he wants. So again, and of course this has to do with the institution of primaries in the Republican Party, but leaving that aside, like, the same institution can both strengthen and weaken liberal democracy. It is what people do in it. And I think that doesn't mean that you can't make adjustments. But in the end, like, if those rules and limitations are not enforced, it doesn't matter. Like, people say, well, Trump can't run for a third time. That's unconstitutional, because it says so in a little piece of paper. If the Supreme Court says that he can, he can. And I don't put much money on the Supreme Court saying that he cannot do it, right? So I think we have to go beyond that. I think this is actually one of the reasons why US democracy is in this terrible state, and why so many in the establishment don't speak out and fight back. There is this incredible belief that of course, the US is superior. It's the bestest democracy in world history. And the other is that the institutions will protect us, right? It's interesting that where you often see the biggest protest is in systems where people don't believe in the institutions. That's why they go into the street, because they know the establishment is not going to protect us. Let me finish with this question about elite, and how can Donald Trump sell that he is not the elite? Because that goes to the essence of what populism is. The distinction in populism is not a financial one, an economic one, not even technically a power one. It is a moral one. Trump is part of the people because allegedly he has the same values and interest as the people. And the consequence, there is a guy called Paul Taggart who wrote a fantastic book about populism in 2000. It has the most amazing density of one-liners of any academic book I know. And one of them, paraphrasing here, is that populism is politics by extraordinary leaders for ordinary people. Almost every populist leader is exceptional. It's not your average person. Think about Berlusconi. Think about Shinawatra in Thailand. They're quite often among the richest people in the country. We had one in the Netherlands, Pim Fortuyn, who lived like a dandy, which goes fundamentally against what the Dutch are, right? But that's okay, because in terms of values, they are the same. Which means that every single time that we, as enlightened liberals poke fun of Donald Trump because he put ketchup on his steak, or because he eats at McDonald's, or because he eats pizza with a knife and fork, people connect with him. Because look, he acts like us and is being vilified by the elite. Because the elite are the ones that have the different values. Now, even actually in terms of power elite, Trump is a very interesting case, which is also very common for populist leaders. They're outsider insiders. Trump was never accepted by the New York power elite. There's a difference, and your country will have exactly the same. There is an old elite, old money, and there's new money. Increasingly, new money has more money than old money. But they're still the nouveau riche. They're still looked down on, they're still excluded from those circles. Many populist leaders are those. Orban was like that, a rural boy who went to law school in Budapest and was never fully accepted, right? It is for them that it stings even more. Does Trump really believe that he's an ordinary person? No, obviously not, right? But he shares very viscerally, like, that hatred of that group that is the elite. And that, and final point, is crucial for Trump more than any other politician. What people do not understand is that Trump has an authenticity that is off the charts for a politician. He hates in an open way, right? Everything that he feels, he tells. He doesn't fake it. He actually hates all of these people, right? He is emotional in his own way because everything is about him, right? He has no agenda. He always talks about himself. And people, it resonates with people, even if they know I don't live like Trump. Right? They see he feels wronged in the same way as I do. He hates in the same way as I do. Remember that Ron DeSantis ran in the midterms in 2022, pretty much on the same agenda, but now saying, but I actually have implemented it in Florida. Ron DeSantis was an absolute fake politician who also tried to talk with the people. It might have sold years ago, but next to Trump, everyone looks fake. Because the weirdest thing about Trump is I cannot remember ever having a politician who so openly says what he wants to do, and everyone ignores it. We take all kind of politicians who we know lie or at the very best bend the truth. We take them literal, and the one person who actually literally pretty much says everything that he's going to do will say, oh, but he doesn't really mean it. His people, they know he means it, and they appreciate it for him, even if he doesn't get it done.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias de verdad por la excelente conferencia, por la discusión que pudimos abrir posteriormente. Muchísimas gracias al Decanato de Ciencias Sociales, a la doctora Isabela Bendaño, también a Marilyn Agüero por facilitarnos la transmisión, a las personas que están detrás de cámaras también facilitando que esto sea posible, al público asistente, a Cas Mudde, a Francisco Robles y a todas las personas que han estado detrás de la creación de este espacio. Muchísimas gracias y seguimos.